Back in 2010, I was sitting in my office when the phone rang. It was a friend telling me to tune into, of all people, Glenn Beck.
We don't talk about 9/11 truthers a lot on this program because it is a dangerous thing.
If you don't remember, Beck was sort of the Alex Jones of the day, your friendly neighborhood conspiracy theorist.
The truth has to be told.
So I turn on the show and there's Beck, wearing a denim shirt and a vest. And he's in front of a magnetic chalkboard with pictures of experts on it. Just the kind you might use to connect your conspiracies with string.
Now their goal is to cut $1 trillion from the defense budget.
And Beck says everyone on the board...
This is Paul. He's a communist.
...has something in common.
George Soros.
They all work for think tanks funded by one particular billionaire.
Funded by? Yeah, George Soros.
If you're into conspiracies, Soros is king. You might have heard speculation that he paid all those protesters at the Women's March in D.C. Really? He's just a rich hedge fund founder and a philanthropist. But eventually, Beck swivels the chalkboard. And there's someone up there who I know really well.
Lacey for the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation.
That's the nuclear policy shop where I worked for 6 years.
And guess who funds it?
You guessed it.
George Soros. George Soros. George Soros. George Soros. And now, ask yourself, is this a problem? I think, yeah, big problem.
Here's the thing, though. There is a problem. It's not a George Soros puppet master problem. This is a different kind of problem. I'm Lacey Healy, and on this episode of Things That Go Boom, we wade into the swamp.
And it's not a good place. In fact, today I said we ought to change it from the word swamp to the word cesspool or perhaps to the word sewer.
We look at how money worked to influence public opinion around the Iran deal and how it works to influence foreign policy in general.
Friendships have fueled Saudi's influence in Washington for decades, lining pockets of Republicans and Democrats alike from K Street to Capitol.
But even more importantly, we look at what exactly is making the swamp so murky. We're going to try to filter out some of that slime to ask one not-so-simple question. Is our foreign policy for sale?
What is actually going on with the economy nowadays? The price of gas? Inflation? Are we in a recession? I'm Jeff Guo, co-host of NPR's Planet Money. Come along with our super team of econ experts as we delve into the stories that show you how the world really works. That's Planet Money from NPR.
It's literally the first line of my book. U.S. foreign policy is for sale. And it's not just for sale, it's an auction.
Ben Freeman is the director of the Foreign Influence Transparency Initiative at the Center for International Policy. His book is literally called The Foreign Policy Auction.
And I am funded by both George Soros.
Where's that chalkboard?
And Charles Koch.
Another billionaire on the opposite side of the spectrum. Ben's tall, handsome. We're friends on Facebook, so I can also tell you that he's really into CrossFit and fostering dogs. He told us money in D.C. politics comes from just about every place you can imagine. Billionaires, corporations,
Lockheed Martin, and
foundations, foreign governments,
Saudi Arabia, China, Japan,
our own government.
And I like to explain it to people via the iceberg analogy. There's the tip of the iceberg, which we can all see. And when you think about the tip of the iceberg in terms of money and politics in D.C., you can think of the traditional avenues of influence, like hiring a lobbying firm. That contract, it's publicly available.
Then there's all the stuff under the iceberg, the stuff you can't see, like think tanks, the kind of nonprofit where I was working when Beck called me out. The thing is, because of their nonprofit status, think tanks aren't required to disclose, well, much of anything about where their money comes from. And some do, some are actually very transparent, but others aren't. And transparency is important because think tanks aren't always neutral. Some take sides. Okay, so if I'm someone working at a think tank, do I have to tell the public what I make?
No.
Do I have to tell them who gives me money?
No.
So then does my boss, does the think tank itself have to disclose who's funding it?
Nope.
So we asked Catherine Sullivan.
Hi, Catherine. Hi, Lacey.
A reporter with another podcast, Trump Inc., to help us understand how some nonprofits that influenced the Iran deal might have been influenced by money.
I decided to take a look at what there was on WikiLeaks.
There are thousands of nonprofits around the world focused on foreign policy. Hundreds focused just on issues related to Iran.
The frustrating thing from this past week was that I spent a lot of time reading 990s. Almost none of them included their donors.
And you might remember, the political environment around the Iran deal was super contentious.
This is a deal that is so good for Iran. They keep their underground nuclear facilities open. They capitulate in no way whatsoever. They
makes it much harder for them to get to an atomic weapon.
Right,
I mean, that's just
that right there.
There were groups on all sides advocating for and against. And Catherine told us that some of these groups were really, really secretive about their funding. Chief among them was a group with a name we can't pronounce.
Yeah. Is it Uani? It's
Uani. Uani, maybe?
I like Wanny.
Wanny.
We'll just call them Wanny.
Yeah, it's a lot of vowels.
UANI.
It seems like they didn't quite think about the acronym before they came up with the name.
United Against a Nuclear Iran.
It became pretty clear early on that this one group, United Against a Nuclear Iran, was very powerful, like they're very loud.
UANI was founded before there was even a deal on the table, back in 2008. Their stated objective was and is, they're still around today, to, quote, prevent Iran from fulfilling its ambition to become a regional superpower possessing nuclear weapons. And during the negotiations, they were out there, working to sway public opinion along these lines. They've also helped write legislation. And one of their most prominent activities was naming and shaming companies that do business with Iran.
They were going on television, on news shows as experts and talking heads.
And these series of sanctions were designed to punish Iran without using bullets and bombs. But
they were testifying in Congress.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you. Once again, I'm honored to sit here on the panel.
Publishing op-eds in newspapers, and they were protesting.
Those are UANI supporters protesting in front of the Warwick Hotel in Manhattan back in 2012.
The Warwick, which is on 6th Avenue.
The Iranian president at the time, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, had traveled to the U.S. for the UN General Assembly. And the protesters didn't want the Warwick to give him a room.
He's deeply insulted the people of New York many times. He calls 9/11 a lie. He says he hates this country. He says he hates this city.
Of course, at the time, Obama's team was in back-channel talks with Iran. But nobody knew that. Catherine also noticed UANI had some big names on their current and former roster. Folks like Jeb Bush and Joe Lieberman, along with a whole slew of folks from the intelligence community. But there's another reason why Catherine says UANI sparked her interest.
It was also unclear where their money came from, and they had a reputation of being quite secretive.
There's this clip of UANI's co-founder Mark Wallace in 2012, where he's asked twice, who funds UANI?
Now, this is a lobbying group. Who is funding this?
Well, first of all, lobbying group, I think, is misplaced. It's really an activist group. We have over 27.
And twice, he dodges the question.
A government funded?
It's not. We're privately funded. It's a 501c3, not-for-profit. Our contributions are confidential because a lot of people who support this, we get contributions from the broad spectrum of the general public, don't want to be...
I don't think many respectable organizations that don't have anything to hide would not disclose their funders.
And they've been asked before to disclose their funders?
Yeah.
And they absolutely will not.
They absolutely will not. I think that's a big red flag.
Catherine learns that there's this one reporter who's been bird-dogging the story of UANI's funding for years.
My name is Eli Clifton. I'm an investigative reporter who focuses on the role of money in influencing U.S. foreign policy.
Eli is a fellow with the Type Media Center. They describe themselves as a newsroom that holds the powerful accountable.
I went to go visit him in his office in New York.
Clear of the closing doors.
When I got there, the office is fairly small. It's very quiet. The part of the office that we were in, there were no windows.
Kind of like diplomacy. Investigative journalism isn't exactly the glamorous gig you might think.
Yeah, Eli spends a lot of time with documents.
And UANI is on his radar.
It's really a fantastic case study and maybe a microcosm of the ways in which American foreign policy is actually influenced and implemented.
You might remember, the Obama administration had been using tough sanctions to bring Iran to the negotiating table.
The sanctions also target Iran's central bank, powerful Revolutionary Guard, individuals and companies. This is consistent with tightening the noose on Iran economically.
But Ioanni is going the extra mile, attacking even the folks that are doing legal business with Iran, like companies selling medicine and vaccines.
This was no longer a coercive strategy to bring Iran to the negotiating table. Instead, it was clear that they wanted something else.
Eli wants to know what. So he starts digging around, and at first, he doesn't turn up much. But he keeps looking at Ioanni's roster of big names. All these former diplomats and politicians.
There was little to no explanation for why this startup organization with a rather narrow focus, based in New York, not in Washington, would have that draw to it. It didn't make sense.
And he notices something kind of odd. Remember Mark Wallace, Ioanni's co-founder? When Eli looks into it, he realizes that some years, he's not even getting paid by Ioanni. His actual salary traces back to this guy named Thomas Kaplan.
While Mark Wallace is leading one of the country's loudest pressure groups on Iran, he's also working as a top executive for Thomas Kaplan at his company called the Electrum Group.
So that's interesting. So who is Kaplan then?
So Thomas Kaplan is a gold and silver investor. He's a billionaire. He speaks with a very particular type of affect, with a kind of indistinguishable accent.
Gold is not a commodity. It is a currency with the longest known provenance that we have. Actually, gold and...
That's Kaplan, speaking on a panel about commodities investing in 2013. He's leaning back in an armchair and wearing his signature three-piece suit.
Thomas Kaplan clearly puts a lot of effort into cultivating a certain image around himself as a Renaissance man.
He has a PhD from Oxford in British colonial history, and he also has some pretty major hobbies.
He started a big cat conservation organization called Panthera. Oh, and he's one of, if not the world's largest collector of Rembrandts.
He is the largest private collector. We checked. He's really into Rembrandt.
There's a way in which he makes you connect with the inner life of his subjects, which could be a man, a woman, it could be a lion.
Eli's pretty confused by the whole Kaplan connection at first, but then something happens that helps him connect the dots.
And then he had a small breakthrough, right?
Yeah, he had a pretty big breakthrough.
Well, I won't say how I found it, but what I did find, or what I did get, is something called United Against Nuclear Iran's Schedule B form.
And it's the part of a nonprofit's tax form that tells you where their money comes from. Normally, this part of that form is not available to the public.
Eli had a snapshot of Ioanni's funding from 2013. The first name is Sheldon Adelson. You might remember him from episode 2. He was one of Trump's top campaign donors, not so big on Iran. In 2013, Adelson gave Ioanni $500,000.
I mean, Sheldon Adelson's pretty extreme. He has, publicly said that we should bomb Iran.
So check mark in that box. That was no surprise.
But then there were two trusts listed on the form. Should I get the form out and read them?
Sure.
The name of the trusts? Anyone just looking at them they wouldn't mean anything to us, the names of the trust. One is called Butterfield Trust. The other one is called New Generations Trust.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look in the address section of what these trusts are, it says care of the Tigris Group.
What is that?
The Tigris Group is a financial firm that's controlled by Thomas Kaplan.
So together, Eli's Schedule B says that these two trusts controlled by Kaplan gave a total of $843,000 to Ioanni, which might not seem like much, but it's about half of Ioanni's total budget for the year. And that's not counting Wallace's salary.
So what you're saying is that in 2013, basically 2 people funded this organization.
Right. Most of their budget came from the Adelson Foundation and from Thomas Kaplan's trusts.
And significantly more from Kaplan.
Yeah, over $300,000 more.
You could buy part of a Rembrandt for that.
Yeah, just a small fraction.
About 3%. So after he finds the Schedule B, Eli has more questions than answers. Up to this point, Kaplan has been super secretive about his connection to Ioanni, but it doesn't really make sense. Why is a gold and silver investor interested in naming and shaming groups doing business with Iran anyway? The simple answer could be that he's just ideologically committed to Ioanni's mission. And that's totally possible. Kaplan's been pretty clear about his position on Iran since the nuclear deal was struck. In 2017, at a Ioanni conference, he likened Iran's expansionist policies to the way a reticulated python digests a goat. But there's also this other thing, which is that the Iranians have, on occasion, used gold to get around sanctions because they've been shut out of international banks. There are even some reports of Iran stockpiling gold to shore up its currency, which could drive up the price of gold, meaning sanctions could be good for Kaplan's bottom line. To add fuel to the fire, an official filing for one of Kaplan's companies, a silver mine, acknowledges that political unrest in the Middle East is a factor in the mine's success. So Eli wonders, could Kaplan and his companies be profiting from Ioanni's work on Iran? Then something happens that looks like it might finally give Eli the answers he's looking for. So now it's 2013, and Obama's team has been in secret talks with Iran.
Good evening.
And it pays off.
Today, that diplomacy opened up a new path toward a world that is more secure.
They reach an interim deal.
For the first time in nearly a decade, we have halted the progress of the Iranian nuclear program.
And they offer some sanctions relief.
We will refrain from imposing new sanctions, and we will allow the Iranian government access to a portion of the revenue that they have been denied through sanctions.
But Ioanni doesn't want the U.S. to let up. Actually, it wants it to double down. So it's playing the bad cop, keeping up the drumbeat with its naming and shaming campaign.
These businesses will add even more to Iran's bottom line. And that means continued development of nuclear technologies and more cash for Hamas and Hezbollah.
All right, so they're causing a big stir for a pretty small organization until one day they name the wrong company.
Or the wrong billionaire. Victor Restis is a kind of mysterious Greek shipping tycoon who calls himself the new Aristotle Onassis. That's the guy who married Jackie. And Ioanni says he's basically running a smuggling fleet, moving oil from Iran to China in violation of sanctions.
And Victor Restis doesn't like that, and he sues Ioanni for defamation.
Oh. And in the process of discovery, Restis' lawyers want to drag Ioanni's members, funders, and financial interests out into the open. It's a mess.
And on top of that, named in this lawsuit is somebody we've heard of, Thomas Kaplan.
Restis goes straight for Kaplan's throat. He wants everything. Kaplan's financial interests, his relationship to Ioanni, because, as it turns out, like Restis, Kaplan's in-laws also own a shipping company. And the two companies are competitors. In court documents related to the lawsuit, Restis' lawyers allege that Ioanni's naming and shaming campaigns align with Kaplan's business interests. At the same time, Kaplan's lawyers tell reporters that he doesn't know anything about Restis or the Ioanni campaign against Restis' company. They say that the demand for Kaplan to turn over his documents is just meant to harass him. So the accusations are flying. And Eli, he's watching this thing very closely.
It quickly devolved into what sounded like, a feud between billionaires.
But he's also hoping the whole thing might pull back the curtain on this opaque organization that he's been trying to understand now for years. And then something happens with the lawsuit that's completely unprecedented.
Pretty much out of nowhere, the government, the Obama Justice Department, steps in.
Without explanation, the Justice Department gets involved, and the case is dismissed.
And I think everybody had the same stunned reaction, which was, this makes no sense. This came out of left field.
Just like that, Eli's search is cut short.
The government steps in and invokes this thing called the state secrets privilege, which says if this lawsuit proceeds, sensitive government secrets will be revealed. And therefore, this lawsuit must not go forward.
Why would Ioanni have state secrets?
That's the question.
The whole event feels fishy because technically, the only group that's supposed to have government secrets is the government itself.
So there was some speculation in the press about how and why Ioanni might have obtained government secrets. Of course, they have no shortage of former government officials on their board, including a former CIA director, So some people thought maybe one of these people shared intelligence with Ioanni. But really, because the case was dismissed, we have no idea if they have secret government information or why they would. And we have no idea if Victor Restis's claims against Kaplan and against Ioanni hold any merit because they were never tested in court.
At the time, Ioanni called Restis's claims little more than a thinly veiled effort to silence them. So we asked Ioanni co-founder and former ambassador Dennis Ross if he could give us any insight into Ioanni's funding. But he says he and his original co-chair, former ambassador Richard Holbrooke, were just focused on policy.
I don't think either one of us asked, where the money was coming. We weren't getting any money from it, so we were focused on the issue of the policy objectives, and that was largely it.
Really? But for the record, he also thinks the suggestion that Kaplan, or Ioanni, might have something to gain from continued unrest in the Middle East is bunk.
I mean, that strikes me as being a leap. This is not an organization that is trying to promote unrest in the Middle East. By countering the Iranians from having a nuclear weapon, they're actually trying to make things more stable. But they're not creating unrest in the Middle East. The unrest in the Middle East is endemic to the region.
He's proud of Ioanni's work, and he trusts its aims. But he says more transparency wouldn't exactly be a bad thing. At the very least, it would help get rid of stories like the ones that led us to these questions in the first place.
As a matter of principle, I think more transparency is better than less. Then you don't have to deal with the aura of suspicion.
So where does that leave us? Today, Ioanni appears stronger than ever. Their annual budget has actually increased since the Restis lawsuit, and perhaps even more than before.
Thank you all. Thank you.
They're incredibly plugged into the current presidential administration.
The regime must no longer be allowed to get its hands on billions of dollars that has already proven it will spread around the world to its client states, rebel groups, and terrorists.
That's Secretary of State Mike Pompeo at their annual conference.
What was so surprising was that the Trump administration sent such high-ranking officials to speak at Ioanni. They sent John Bolton. They sent Mike Pompeo.
Doing business in Iran only pours money into a regime that hoards it for itself and misuses it for violent ends.
Eli tried to go, but he was turned away at the door. Catherine couldn't get much access either.
I've tried repeatedly to get in touch with Ioanni, both by email and by phone, and they haven't replied to us.
She also reached out to Kaplan. He declined to comment.
So Ioanni is still around. They're still naming and shaming companies. They're still advocating for greater pressure on Iran. And we still don't know where their funding comes from.
And that's kind of a frustrating end to our story. I know. But it's also exactly what we all should expect when some of the loudest, most active organizations and think tanks that influence policies like the Iran deal aren't required to disclose their funding. It's a problem because Ben Freeman says that means the policies they produce could be tainted.
The perception of think tanks is that they are sort of the referees in DC, that these are the folks who are providing objective analysis in that information, it's not politically driven. That is the idealized view of think tanks, and it is a completely naive view of think tanks.
Folks like Kaplan are private citizens, so we can't say for sure whether they're interested in Iran because of ideology or because it benefits their bottom line, though it certainly looks a little suspicious. What we can say is that think tanks and nonprofits also receive a lot of funding from defense contractors and foreign governments. Millions of dollars in some cases.
And the amount that these folks are spending, it absolutely dwarfs the advocates for peace and for the folks who would like to keep us out of foreign wars.
And while most groups say they're still neutral, that the money isn't tied to any particular outcome, it's tough to criticize the guy that's paying your bills because there can be consequences.
I think if I'm Lockheed Martin and a think tank keeps disparaging the largest thing that I sell, I think I'm probably going to stop giving you money, and I'll give my money to somebody that will say nice things about that thing I sell.
Ben says nearly all of the most prominent foreign policy think tanks in Washington have accepted money from authoritarian regimes, like Saudi Arabia, which has the ability to impact how we behave toward other countries. like Iran. It's hard to believe that at least some of that money isn't having an impact on the debate.
I think the system is actually rigged. It's rigged towards the money.
Next time on Things That Go Boom, we'll talk about the other side of the proverbial coin. We'll ask how our sanctions policy is playing out inside Iran.
People are selling their unused cosmetics to get money for immigration.
There have been decades of Iranian popular resiliency in the face of economic difficulty.
Whatever doesn't kill you just makes you stronger. So far, we are not dead.
Things That Go Boom is a production of PRX and Inkstick Media. We also have a weekly global security newsletter called Critical State. Head over to inkstickmedia.com to sign up and visit us on social at Inkstick Media. Our show is produced by Ruth Morris. Catherine Fink is our assistant producer, and Mary Beth Kirshner is our story whisperer. Darian Schulman composes our music, and our engineer is Robin Wise. A huge thank you to John Barth for his review, and to Catherine Sullivan for her work on this episode. Thanks also to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, Plowshares Fund, and N Square for making our show possible. Yes, we are a nonprofit, and yes, those are our funders. See? Isn't it nice when you know? P.S. Soros, if you're listening, call me. I'll take your money anytime.